Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into some serious source material today. We're talking George Soros and his impact on Texas justice, specifically those DA races everyone's buzzing about.
It's a fascinating one, right? You've got strong opinions on all sides, claims about crime waves, radical agendas, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. So we're cutting through the noise, looking at what your sources actually say. And it gets interesting fast because we're not talking about the governor's mansion here.
Not at all. This is about district attorneys, those local races people might glance over. But that's where Soros and his groups get strategic.
Okay, so before we get into the thick of it, for anyone who's thinking, district attorney, what's the big deal? Break it down for us. Why are these elections so crucial? Think of it this way. DAs are like conductors of the justice system. They decide who gets charged, how aggressively cases are pursued, even influence sentencing. This isn't just one courtroom, it's the whole system.
So Soros recognizes this, and he's funneling money into Texas, specifically through this Texas Justice and Public Safety PAC. It sounds pretty official. What's the deal with this PAC?
It's his main vehicle, right?
Right.
And we're talking big money flowing into some of the most populous counties in the state. Harris County, that's Houston, they've been very active there. Travis County, Austin's stomping grounds. And of course, Dallas County, massive population center. Can't forget Bexar County either.
Bexar County, and for anyone outside of Texas, that's San Antonio. I got to get that pronunciation right. Big cities, big money, but is it translating into actual results?
Oh, absolutely. The sources show a string of victories for candidates backed by this PAC, often against opponents who were outspent significantly. This wasn't just talk, it was putting people in power.
And those people, those newly elected DAs, came in with a reform agenda, right? Changes to the justice system they promised voters.
And that's where things get really interesting, because what sounds good on paper doesn't always play out smoothly in the real world. And that's what we're going to unpack next. The reforms, the results, and the debate raging in Texas.
All right, so we've got these new DAs backed by Soros taking office in some of Texas's biggest cities, promising to shake things up. But like you said, reform can be a loaded word. What looks good on a campaign flyer might not always work out so well in real life, right?
Absolutely, and that's where the real debate heats up. It's one thing to talk about ideals, but when those ideas meet the complexities of the criminal justice system, things get messy. And that's what we see playing out in these Texas cities.
Exactly, and that's what we're diving into today, the nitty-gritty of those reforms and the ripple effects they've had. So let's break it down DA by DA, starting with Dallas County, John Creuzot. One policy that really jumped out from the source material was his decision to decriminalize theft of items under $750. That seems like a pretty radical move. What was the logic behind that?
Well, it was controversial, that's for sure. Creuzot argued it was about focusing on crimes of necessity. You know, differentiating between someone stealing essentials like food or medicine out of desperation and, say, organized retail theft rings.
Yeah.
He wanted to address the root causes of crime, things like poverty and lack of opportunity.
Okay, so context is key. But the sources also point to a spike in certain crime statistics in Dallas around the same time this policy went into effect. Is that just a coincidence, or is there a direct link?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's tempting to draw a straight line between a policy change and crime data, but it's rarely that simple. You've got so many factors at play, especially in a place like Dallas, a major metropolitan area.
So it's more nuanced than just saying this policy caused crime to go up.
Exactly. Correlation doesn't equal causation, as they say. The sources that are critical of Soros and these reforms, they point to those crime stats as evidence that these policies are backfiring. But then you have other factors, like the pandemic, which had a huge impact on crime rates nationwide. It's almost impossible to isolate one variable and say, this is the cause, this is the effect.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. And speaking of tangled, let's move on to Harris County, Houston, where things get even more complicated. You've got Kim Ogg, initially backed by Soros, but then they have a very public falling out. Then Sean Tier enters the picture, gets even more funding from those same networks, and picks up the reform mantle. It's like a political thriller unfolding in the DA's office. What's going on there?
Well, it shows you the internal dynamics within this movement, right? Ogg faced criticism from both sides. Some said she wasn't progressive enough, wasn't moving fast enough with reforms, while others argued her policies were too lenient and emboldening criminals. It was a no-win situation.
Caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. And then Tariq comes in, even more aligned with Soros's vision, and he really doubles down on those reforms. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in Harris County. It's a microcosm of the larger debate over the direction of criminal justice.
And it's not just about the DAs themselves, it's about their relationship with law enforcement. The source material hints at some tension there. What's the dynamic like between these reform-minded DAs and the police?
Yeah, that's a big one. You have police unions, who often represent rank-and-file officers, and they're pushing back against some of these reforms. They feel like their hands are tied, that the DA's office isn't backing them up, that it's become too lenient on criminals.
So it's a clash of philosophies, essentially.
In a way, yes. You have these fundamental disagreements about the role of the justice system. Is it primarily about punishment? Or is it about rehabilitation? And how do you balance those competing goals? It's a question that's been debated for decades, and it's playing out in real time in these cities.
It's a debate with huge stakes, for sure. Now, let's hop over to Travis County, Austin, where we find Jose Garza, who's been called the most progressive of the Soros-backed DAs in Texas. One of the criticisms leveled against him is this idea of a revolving door of justice, where people are arrested and then quickly released back onto the streets. What's the reality of that claim?
Well, Garza, like many of these DAs, campaigned on a platform of reducing mass incarceration, particularly for nonviolent offenses. He argues that the old system was disproportionately harming minority communities, trapping them in a cycle of poverty and incarceration. So he's trying to break that cycle by changing how bail is handled, how cases are prosecuted.
Okay, so it's about addressing what he sees as systemic inequalities within the system.
Right. And again, whether or not you agree with that approach is a different question, but it's important to understand the rationale behind it. He's trying to change the system from the inside out, which inevitably leads to pushback from those who believe the old ways were better.
So it's a balancing act between reform and, I guess, maintaining public safety, or at least the perception of public safety.
Exactly. And it's not just a debate happening in courtrooms and legislative chambers. It's playing out in communities, in neighborhoods across these cities. And one thing that comes up in the source material is this sense among some residents that they're being left out of the conversation, that these reforms are being imposed from above without really listening to their concerns.
That's a crucial point, right? It's one thing to have these grand ideas about transforming the justice system, but it's another thing entirely to actually bring the community along with you on that journey.
Exactly. And that's a criticism that's been leveled at this movement, that it's a top-down approach driven by elites who are disconnected from the realities on the ground. And when people feel like their voices aren't being heard, they're more likely to resist those changes, even if those changes might ultimately benefit them.
It's about trust, right? Trust between law enforcement and the community, trust between elected officials and the people they represent. And when that trust breaks down, it's incredibly difficult to build it back up.
Absolutely. And that's something that these reform-minded DAs have to grapple with.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just change policies. They have to bring the community along to build those bridges of understanding.
It's a tall order, that's for sure. Well, let's move on to our final stop on this deep dive into Texas DA races, Bexar County, San Antonio, where we find Joe Gonzalez. One of his big pushes has been cash bail reform, which, like many of these reforms, sounds good in theory, but gets a lot more complicated in practice. What's the situation in Bexar County?
Well, Gonzalez is part of a growing movement across the country to eliminate or drastically reduce the use of cash bail. His argument, and it's reflected in the source material, is that cash bail is inherently unfair, that it punishes the poor by keeping them locked up simply because they can't afford to pay their way out.
So someone who poses no real danger to the community, but who's charged with a relatively minor offense, could be stuck in jail for weeks or even months simply because they can't afford to make bail.
Exactly. And Gonzalez argues that that system disproportionately harms minority communities and perpetuates a cycle of poverty and incarceration. He wants to move to a system where pretrial detention is based on risk, not wealth. So if someone is deemed a flight risk or a danger to the community, they'd be held without bail. But if they're not considered a risk, they'd be released while they await trial.
Which sounds fair in principle, but I imagine there's a lot of pushback against that kind of reform, right?
Oh, absolutely. You have law enforcement groups, as well as conservative lawmakers, who argue that these reforms are dangerous, that they're letting dangerous criminals loose on the streets. And they point to cases where individuals who were released pre-trial went on to commit violent crimes as evidence that these reforms are backfiring.
It's that same tension we keep seeing, right? That clash between those who believe the system is fundamentally broken and needs to be overhauled, and those who believe that those reforms go too far and put public safety at risk.
Exactly. And it's not just a theoretical debate. It's playing out in real time in communities across Texas and across the country. And it's a debate that doesn't have easy answers.
And to make things even more complicated, it's not just local stakeholders involved in this fight. Our sources point out that Governor Abbott himself has weighed in on these DA races and these reforms, and he hasn't been shy about criticizing them.
That's right. Abbott has made it very clear that he sees these reforms as dangerous and misguided. He's even gone so far as to support legislation that would limit the power of DAs to implement these kinds of reforms.
So it's gone from these local races, these local debates, to the state level.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole issue so fascinating. It's a microcosm of the larger political and cultural divides in this country. You have these progressive prosecutors who are trying to change the system from within, and you have conservative lawmakers who are pushing back, trying to maintain the status quo.
It's a battle of ideologies playing out in courtrooms and legislative chambers across the state, and it's a battle that's far from over. So, for our listeners in Texas, and really anyone following this issue, what should they be paying attention to as the story continues to unfold? What are the key things to keep an eye on?
So much to unpack, right? We've gone from campaign promises to courtroom battles, crime stats, to those real-world impacts. But there's this underlying current through all our sources, something we can't ignore.
Yeah, it keeps popping up, doesn't it? It's the sheer scale of influence we're talking about, the outsized role money plays, specifically Soros's money. It's the elephant in the room, no matter what you think about Soros himself. Whether you see him as this force for good or some boogeyman for conservatives to rally against, that level of financial involvement in local elections, that should be giving everyone pause. We're not talking about a few thousand here. We're talking situations where one person's donations make up like 80-90% of a DA's campaign funds. That's huge GE.
Right. And it goes beyond just slogans and attack ads. This gets to the heart of local democracy, right? If one very wealthy individual can essentially handpick a DA, how much power does your vote really hold?
It's like suddenly your local election is being decided by someone you've never even heard of, let alone voted for. That's got to make you think, no matter where you stand politically.
It does, and it circles back to that tension we've been talking about all along. That disconnect between these big ideas about reforming the system and what it actually looks like on the ground for everyday people.
Exactly. This isn't just some abstract debate. This is about your community, your safety, your vote.
And that's what makes this whole issue so important to grapple with. It's not about finding easy answers. It's about asking the tough questions, being willing to challenge our own assumptions, and engaging in these conversations even when they're uncomfortable.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've covered a lot of ground today. From the power of those DA offices to the nitty-gritty of bail reform, the impact of big money in politics. We went deep on Soros's involvement in Texas, but more importantly, we've given you the tools to keep digging, to draw your own conclusions.
Because ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide what kind of justice system we want, what role we believe money should play in our elections, and how we hold our elected officials accountable.
And that's what this deep dive's all about, giving you the information, the context, so why you should be informed, engaged citizens. Keep those conversations going, keep asking those tough questions, and until next time, keep on diving deep.